So the United States policy towards the Soviet Union after the Second World War was to try and stem the spread of communism throughout the world, particularly as it was being pushed by the Soviet Union. So let's get an idea of where that mindset came from for the United States. So George Kennan was an American diplomat who was based in Moscow during the 1940s. He was also a keen student of Russian history. And in 1946, he wrote an influential document, what became known as Article X, or sometimes the Long Telegram, where he basically tried to explain to US US government the mindset of the Soviet Union towards the United States and the rest of the world. He basically explained that the Soviet Union believed that capitalism and socialism could never be at peace, and therefore that a war between the two was inevitable, and a war in the sense of not necessarily ongoing and continued open hostilities, but political and military tension, that the Soviet Union believed that this war was inevitable. It was also rooted, according to Kennan, in a much deeper sense of Russian identity with the rest of the world, that the Russians had always fundamentally distrusted the rest of the world. They believed the rest of the world had it out for them. And so in the Russian mindset, examples of Napoleon's invasion of Russia or Hitler's invasion of Russia was kind of evidence of the very real danger that the rest of the world posed to Russia. And therefore Russia's response was to be hostile and aggressive as a way of deterring the rest of the world from attacking it, according to Kennan. However, he also said that the Soviets were kind of afraid of force, that the Soviets understood that the United States and the other Western allies combined certainly were much stronger than the Soviet Union, particularly with the United States having nuclear arms. And of course, this telegram was in 1946, before the Soviets had developed their own nuclear weapons. And what he basically said was that the Soviets kind of respected and were afraid of people who stood up to them, that appeasement, the policy we talked about that the British and French governments used towards the Germans during the 1930s, would not work with the Soviets. Rather, the Soviets had to be confronted, their ambitions limited, that wherever the Soviets tried to spread their influence, the United States would be in its best interest to kind of stand up to the Soviets and prevent them from doing so. So this became the basis of what becomes known as the policy of containment. Which essentially was the American foreign policy, or the base of American foreign policy for much of the second half of the 20th century, i.e. we're going to try and contain the spread of Soviet influence through the promotion of communism around the world. And therefore that would be the United States' reaction to world developments, if there was a fear that not so much left-wing governments, because actually the Soviets had very little sympathy for left-wing governments that were not taking their orders directly from Marxist policymakers in Moscow, but that if there was an effort to, the Soviets were influencing or trying to promote communist insurgency somewhere, the United States would get involved. And the first example of this takes place in 1947, that the communist rebels, actually both in Greece and in Turkey, were posing real threats to the governments of Turkey and Greece. Britain traditionally had been the power that had kind of supported Greece and tried to help Greece maintain its independence since it had become independent in 1830. But the British were bankrupt after the Second World War, and essentially the British government turned to the United States and said, we no longer can afford to support the Greek government. It's possible that the Greek government will fall to communist influence. And American President Harry Truman decided that the United States would step into that gap, fill the void left by the British, support the government, give the Greek government economic and military support in return for helping them defeat the communist rebels there. And this essentially becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine essentially is containment with Harry Truman's name attached to it, that he basically announces in Congress that in future the American government will use financial aid, training, weapons, supplies, whatever it is, to assist governments who are fighting against communist rebels, or where there's a real threat of a communist takeover, especially if it's communist takeover influenced by the Soviet Union. I want to talk a little bit about the emergence of two alliances. The video you saw in the previous clip would have given you some background on this, but just to understand it a little more. So in 1948, some of the countries of Western Europe, the United Kingdom, France, and the Low Countries refers to Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and Belgium, had signed the Treaty of Brussels. This essentially was a military defensive alliance between these powers, agreeing to help one another if the Soviet Union were to attack Western Europe. And of course, if you look at the map, look where East Germany is. I mean, it really was not that, the Soviet influence was quite close to some of these Western European countries. In 1949, the United States, Canada, and other European countries joined in the Treaty of Brussels. It was renamed as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in 1949, so expanded to include other Western powers as well who had been involved in the Second World War. So NATO, and essentially NATO's core mission was to be a defensive alliance against any attack. The idea was if any member was attacked by someone, then all the powers would come to its assistance. Of course, this was obviously imagined as a defensive measure against the Soviet Union. But actually, the only time that the NATO treaty has been put into effect, that is when a member state has been attacked and the others have helped, I guess, retaliate in a military effort, was actually after September 11 attacks in 2001 in the United States. The invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 was a NATO operation in response to the attack upon the United States. NATO expanded over the course of the 50s and 60s. It was later joined by Greece, who I just mentioned was an obvious US ally, Turkey, and West Germany. West Germany in particular was controversial because the Soviets had always insisted that Germany should be a neutral country. It should not align with either East or West. And of course, that was the Soviet position because they felt that was the best they could hope for. There was no realistic chance that West Germany would become part of the Soviet bloc. And so it demonstrated the United States was committed to a European alliance, but it also provoked a reaction amongst the Soviets, who decided in 1955, which was the year that Germany joined NATO, West Germany, to create their own defensive alliance, known as the Warsaw Pact, which essentially was the Soviet Union and the various communist-influenced countries of Eastern Europe. So you see East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. In theory, all these countries are supposed to be independent of the Soviet Union. In reality, only Albania really had any kind of degree of independence, that the others were very much heavily under the influence of the Soviet Union. You also see in the map here Yugoslavia in yellow. Yugoslavia was actually a communist country, but it was a communist country that was not aligned with the Soviet Union. In fact, there was a great deal of tension between Marshal Tito, the communist leader in Yugoslavia, and especially Joseph Stalin. So the Warsaw Pact is supposed to be a counterbalance to NATO, but in reality it reflects essentially the domination of the Russian Communist Party over much of Eastern Europe, even though in theory the various independent countries here are supposed to be free of Soviet control, that they're independent communist states themselves. Just one thing I'd like to draw your attention to as well, that while these countries were, just to understand the organization of Eastern Europe, north of Poland, you would have what are today called the Baltic Republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. They had been independent countries between the First and Second World War, but the Soviet Union had annexed them once again and simply made them part of the Soviet Union. So Poland, for example, in theory was an independent country influenced by the Soviet Union, but the Baltic republics were simply swallowed up whole into the Soviet Union, and now Europe was firmly divided into two armed camps. So in 1953, Stalin died, and this is the beginning point where the Soviet Union starts to move away from being a completely totalitarian dictatorship to, while still a very heavily state-controlled government, and certainly one in which freedoms are very limited compared to the Western world, at least something more resembling a semi-normal state as opposed to the kind of nightmare that was imposed upon Soviet citizens during the rule of Joseph Stalin. Of course, Stalin had murdered anyone he considered to be a potential threat to his rule, and the result was there was not a very clear order of succession about who would take over Stalin after he died. So what we actually get is a power struggle over the next couple of years between two men. One is Nikita Khrushchev, pictured here, who was a long-time Stalin ally, although as you'll see in a moment was certainly no fan of Stalin's policies. And he was opposed by Beria, who was who had been the head of the Soviet secret police. So there's kind of a power struggle for a couple of years between these men. Eventually, Khrushchev gets the upper hand and actually has Beria and some of his allies executed. So just to show you that, yeah, the Soviet Union is still not in a kind of normal sense of political power is still not transitioning normally from one government to another, where the losers of these power struggles are still murdered, although happily, Beria and his execution, that was really the kind of last time we saw this kind of brutal execution of enemies and political enemies in the Soviet Union. So Khrushchev emerges as leader in 1955. He himself had been a coal miner and a steel worker at various stages, so had very much come from moderate or modest background himself. And becomes leader of the Soviet Union. And under Khrushchev, the Soviet Union does take a step in terms of easing its relations with the Western world and also kind of lightening up a little bit in terms of the nature of its dictatorship. He famously gave a speech in 1956 that's called the Secret Speech, where he denounced Joseph Stalin. So at a meeting of the Communist Party in Moscow in 1956, he basically gave a 4-hour speech where he said, yeah, Stalin was a homicidal maniac. He often executed people who either maybe opposed him but didn't deserve to be executed, or people who had simply done nothing wrong or executed due to Stalin's paranoia. And so you see, he's denouncing the cult of personality, basically saying that what Stalin did was not what was communism at all. It was a kind of murderous, selfish dictatorship. And it's called a secret speech, and partly because only a limited number of people were actually allowed to hear the speech in person, but the government quite quickly printed copies and distributed them around the Soviet Union. So it wasn't, people became quickly aware that Khrushchev had made this speech denouncing Stalin, which was risky. I mean, Stalin was only dead a couple of years. There were a lot of people who very much believed the idea that Stalin was a great leader who could do no wrong. In some ways, Khrushchev was challenging the kind of mindset that had helped govern the Soviet Union for the previous 25 years. But other people welcomed his honesty, his kind of bravery in denouncing Stalin, and hoped that it marked a chapter in which the Soviet Union was beginning to change and change for the better. So it did provoke a strong reaction in the Soviet Union. And Khrushchev did allow some moderate reforms. Many people who had been locked up in concentration camps by Stalin were released. Some limited free speech was allowed in the Soviet Union, although it certainly was no open, free and democratic society. But compared to what had been happening under Stalin, there was a relative easing of a sense of oppression that people felt in the Soviet Union. The end of political of terror was used as a political weapon. As I said, Beria was the last member of the Soviet government to be simply executed because he was on the wrong side of a political fallout. Afterwards, things became at least a little more normal in that sense. The Communist Party became more open in its dealings. I mentioned that Khrushchev's speech was eventually published, and this became more standard. The Communist Party at least became more open in terms of its policy making, how its policies were being made, how its decisions were reached, and what its plans for the future were.